Welcome to the Urbanist Agenda, the podcast that doesn't drive into the city. I'm joined today by Doug Gordon from the War on Cars podcast. Welcome back to the show, Doug.
It is great to be back. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's very good to have you. So I don't read the urbanist news maybe as much as I used to these days, but there is one story that I just could not escape everywhere I went, every time I loaded any kind of social media, whether it was algorithms showing it to me or people tagging me. It was this whole New York City congestion charge thing. So as a resident of New York and an expert in these kind of things, I wanted to bring you on to talk about it.
I am an expert if that includes being an expert in just rage tweeting for the last 3 weeks.
That's what
I'm
I
very
want.
good
I
at
want
that.
the expert in rage tweeting.
Yeah,
I
very
did
good at
notice
that.
you CC'd on a lot of these things. So
Yeah, I actually had taken a Twitter hiatus just because it's such a mess and terrible.
yeah, you know, the Nazis and all.
Yeah,
Lots of-
minor details like that. But I did get back on just to follow and help amplify some of the news and the fight
Right.
to reinstate congestion pricing. We'll get to it.
All right. So for anybody that doesn't have the same social media bubble as the two of us, why don't you explain a little bit about what happened here? So this is basically about New York City was proposing a congestion charge, but it didn't quite go the way it's planned.
Yeah, it depends on how far back you want to go in time, but let's just go back to 2019. So 2019, Governor Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo, who was then our governor, with the state legislature, passes a law allowing New York City to levy tolls on drivers entering Manhattan. That is basically below 60th Street, coming off the West Side Highway, FDR Drive, basically anyone coming into the core business district, sort of what you think about when you think about Manhattan, if you're not from here, short of Central Park, to toll drivers. That law came about over years of advocacy. And to dial it back even a little farther, the previous 2 years had been in New York City. There was what was called the Summer of Hell. There were viral videos of subways breaking down, of passengers trapped on trains, just endless delays, all kinds of stuff. That was the result of just decades of mismanagement, defunding, all the kind of stuff that happens with American infrastructure.
Yeah.
And this 2019 law finally moves us towards a path of doing something about A, congestion, because it's right there in the name, congestion pricing, but B, funding for our transit, for the Metropolitan Transit Authority, the MTA, which runs our subways, our buses, and our commuter rails. And the way the law was structured was that it was legally mandated congestion pricing to raise about $1 billion a year in revenue for the MTA. And also, of course, reduce the number of cars coming into the city.
The MTA being the organization that runs the subways, for anyone not familiar with New York.
Exactly. And they also run Metro North, the Long Island Railroad, our commuter rail system. So this is really like a regional-wide plan. Not just the immediate effects would be felt in Manhattan, but you would have used that money to upgrade stations in Long Island for commuters coming into the city.
Right.
And there obviously was some confusion in the general public about, well, on the one hand, you're supposed to raise all this money for the MTA. On the other hand, you're supposed to lower the amount of cars coming into the city. Aren't those fundamentally at odds? And the answer is, well, they kind of came up with a sweet spot, right? Where they decided to toll drivers $15. It was more for trucks, less for overnight hours, but $15 to enter the city.
Right.
And that would reduce traffic by anywhere from 10 to 20% in the city while raising this money. So that is sort of your very, very brief history of congestion pricing. You can actually go back to the 1960s, the 1970s, and learn all about the plans to toll drivers coming into the city when they recognized that the city was choking with traffic, with pollution, and something had to be done. Now, flash forward to just about a month ago, June 5th, our current governor, Kathy Hochul, announces that she is going to indefinitely pause, which is exactly her phrasing, congestion pricing.
Definitely pause.
Congestion pricing was supposed to start June 30th. So as we are recording this just a few days ago. So this threw all of us, everyone, into a tizzy mere 3 weeks before congestion pricing is set to go. The cameras are up. All the infrastructure is in place. The MTA, which is running the program, had spent something like $500 million on just the gantries, the cameras alone, not to mention all of the other infrastructure and personnel that go into this. And she just announces, no, sorry, we're going to pause it. We can get into why she chose that language, why she didn't say, I'm just canceling it or ending it. But that is where we are now. So June 30th has come and gone. Congestion pricing has not begun. It's an open question as to when or if it will begin, but the fight is not over.
So this is talking about like the lower part of Manhattan. It's not even like the whole island. It's the lower part. Is that right?
Yeah, 60th Street and below.
And this is the place in the United States where all the transit is, effectively. It's like, got so many trains, so many subways. There is nowhere in the U.S. that's more accessible by public transit than this area.
And not only is it the most transit-rich city in North America, the majority of people who access Manhattan, especially for commuting, do so by transit.
Yeah.
There were surveys and all kinds of studies done by various advocacy groups, one of them the Tri-State Transportation Campaign. They found that if you look at basically every legislative district in New York State, so that includes Queens, Brooklyn, where I live, Long Island, where many people commute from, fewer than 3% in any legislative district of commuters come into Manhattan by car.
Yeah.
In most districts, it's barely 1%. So the majority of people in the region access Manhattan via Grand Central Terminal, Penn Station, the Port Authority, or just taking the subway like I do.
Yeah, and I mean, you say the majority. It's the vast, vast, vast majority here. You're talking 1 to 3%. I mean, that's wild.
A very small number of drivers, and as your audience knows very well, a very small number of cars, percentage-wise, can still mean a mess in terms of traffic. And on top of that, this charge, the $15, you heard a lot of people say, oh, it's unfair to working people. It's unfair to the working class or the poor. No, that's just factually incorrect. If you drive into Manhattan for work, you are on average wealthier than the average transit rider. That sort of makes sense. Someone who takes the bus versus someone who can drive into Manhattan, afford to park, afford all the time it takes.
Yeah, Manhattan is an expensive place to begin with to do anything, but especially to park.
Right. And that's not to say there aren't people who are low income who need to drive in for the occasional medical appointment or other things like that. But you can't base policy on individual hard cases. You really have to look overall at what does the data say. And the data basically says wealthier people are driving into Manhattan, the very people who could afford a $15 toll, or if they can't, afford to make other choices.
Yeah. And the other thing is that, well, I mean, this is what I associate with New York is the crazy amount of traffic. Like when I've been to Manhattan, you're on the street and there's just piles of cars everywhere. There's just cars, especially at rush hour. And I remember reading once that around 70%, and actually in that lower part, it's probably over 70% of households do not own a car. So
yeah, so if you take all 5 boroughs, it's 54% of households do not own a car, but that includes Staten Island, Outer Borough, Queens, which are much more suburban.
Right, if it includes Staten Island, that's
right.
Yeah.
So the Upper West Side, for example, 76% of households do not own a car. And of the 24% of households that do own a car, nobody is driving from the Upper West Side, 79th Street to 32nd Street to their office.
Yeah.
They're taking the train. If they have a car, it's for weekend trips or things like that. So this would have affected just a tiny, tiny number of people. And now it's gone, at least for now.
Well, I mean, the way this is always pitched, whenever these things happen, and you see the same thing in Toronto, they're always like, oh, this is going to hurt the poor, these poor people. And the media will find like one guy who says, oh, I got to drive in or something. But I mean, this is not going to affect poor people, as you said. But this is always the line they use. It's always the line they use because the alternative sounds like they're just being an asshole, saying like, I just want to drive my car and I don't give a shit about everyone else. But the real reason why 3% can make this difference is because these people are influential in some way. They have to be.
Yes.
Because if it was 3% and they were poor people, we know full well the government doesn't give a shit about 3% of poor people.
No, I think the thing to understand is that the main character in American politics and transportation policy in particular is the suburban driver.
Yeah.
That is the only person that matters to most of our elected officials. A point I made on our podcast when we recorded an emergency episode the day after that this went down is that what coal miners are to Republicans, drivers are to urban Democrats.
Yeah.
They are the real New Yorkers. In our case here, they are the working stiffs, the people who are just trying to get through traffic to get to their job. And the bus rider who is stuck in traffic behind that driver doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The subway rider who is stuck on a train that's delayed because many of our signals date back to the LaGuardia administration, to the 1930s, and break down all the time, that person doesn't exist.
Yeah. Honestly, it's just so frustrating. Everything I read about this was so frustrating because I'm like, none of this matches reality. None of this is based in reality at all. It's this fiction that they spin about this. And it's just so infuriating to read because I get it if you were talking about Phoenix, Arizona or something, right? I get it.
Oh, for sure. For sure. You know, if this were Los Angeles or Phoenix and you said, you know, we're suddenly going to toll everybody who is hopping on a freeway.
Yeah.
That would be unfair because there aren't good transit options. The majority of people do drive and they have no choice but to drive. Mm-hmm. And that kind of catch-22 that you sometimes find yourself in New York where people say like, oh, you can't improve the bus service. Why? Because the bus service is terrible and we all rely on our cars. Well, What if we did something about the bus service? No, you can't. And you get in this endless loop.
Yeah.
That doesn't really apply in the case of New York City. Like there are options. They're not all perfect in every neighborhood, in every situation. But there are options here.
Yeah.
Most of us take them.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you were saying there is this infuriating thing that I get all the time doing what I do, obviously on YouTube and social media, is I get these people saying, I can't take transit because transit has all of these problems. And so I drive. And then when you say, okay, well, why don't we improve transit? It's never that. It's never transit has these problems, so therefore I drive. Like nobody is ever saying transit has these problems, so let's fix transit. It's always transit has these problems, so therefore everyone has to drive everywhere all the time. And It's just like, come on, people. But this is the thing. It's so disingenuous. When people say like transit is terrible, so I have to drive, they don't actually care about transit. They were never going to take transit. It wouldn't matter if it was like freaking Switzerland. Those people would still be in their cars.
No.
So I'm like, I don't really care what you have to say about this. I want to deal with real facts, like actual reality here, not your whims.
Yeah. And, you know, I don't want to take over hosting duties here, but I wonder if we shouldn't talk about why Hochul decided to do this. Because
well, I think, no, that is absolutely the right thing
we're
to do.
sort of getting into it with drivers complaining, and that's not going to be a big shock to your audience.
Yeah. So that's the thing. The reality is it is a very small number of drivers, but those drivers are listened to. Those drivers are influential. So tell us, why is it that 3% of people can cause this to change?
Well, among those 3% of people are our other elected officials.
Yeah.
And they are what we call here in New York the placard class. They are people who drive around who have a parking placard, which often entitles them to park for free in spaces that are not always legal for other people to use. And the reporting that came out after this went down, largely in Politico, but a couple of other sources, was that Hochul was influenced by Hakeem Jeffries, who is the Democratic leader in the House of Representatives. Now, we obviously have a really important election coming up in November. There were primaries that just happened. And the reporting suggested that Jeffries was essentially scared that congestion pricing was so unpopular that it was going to affect some House races and possibly cost Democrats any opportunity they have of retaking the House from Republicans. A point I have been making about that is congestion pricing, yes, was unpopular before it launched. And we will definitely get into the pattern you see around the world where it's always unpopular before it launches. But that is a separate question from, is congestion pricing an issue that voters are bringing with them into the voting booth in places like Long Island or upstate New York? And the answer to that second question is no. It's probably not even a top 10 or 15 issue. Things like immigration, crime, the economy, those are bigger issues. Given the very few drivers who are coming from such places, I really doubt that that was much of an issue. Doesn't mean it wasn't a factor in Jeffrey's decision or conversation with Governor Hochul, but who knows? Other stories emerged, including directly from the governor, that she talked to a few diner owners and restaurant owners.
I saw that. She was like, I've been talking to people in diners.
Which, the New York Times loves to talk to Trump voters in Iowa diners to get the real American story. But she was talking to people in diners literally around the block or practically across the street. In one case, directly across the street from Grand Central Terminal, a place no one arrives to via car.
Right.
And this is just not a way anyone should base transportation policy in a region of tens of millions of people, even if you just zero in on the 8.5 million people who live in New York City. So she was saying she was talking to these people and they were concerned about the cost of goods or driving in from New Jersey. If you know anything about New Jersey, people are not driving from there to Manhattan to go to a diner. New Jersey has plenty of great diners.
That is absurd.
Along as many highways as you can imagine. So I think a lot of this was just her flailing, her panicking, getting cold feet, looking at the popularity of congestion pricing in the month before implementation and pulling the plug off of nothing more than vibes, basically.
Yeah. That really is vibes-based politics here. This is not based in any way on reality at all.
Yeah.
But when you say unpopular, let's talk a little bit numbers here. What does unpopular mean in this case?
Well, you see this in city after city where congestion pricing has gone in. It is rather unpopular in the many months before it goes in, extremely unpopular in the few weeks before it goes in. Then you start to see after it's implemented a slow creep up, majority support. I believe Stockholm, immediately after it was implemented, you had more than 50% approval. 3 months later, a year later, you had something like 70% approval.
Yeah.
It's just common.
Let's actually talk about Stockholm for a second here, because I do want to get into the exact numbers, because what I think is funny is that New York was actually, by international comparisons, actually not unpopular at all.
Not that bad at all, no.
No. So Stockholm introduced congestion charging in, well, I think it was 2005. Yeah, it's 2005. I'll put some links in the show notes if anybody's interested in reading more. But leading up to it, it was, as you said, not very popular. A little over 40% people were in favor of it. And then right before, that dropped down to almost 30% of people. So you're talking about like 2/3 of people were not in favor of this happening, right? Then it gets implemented, and within a year, 50% of people are approving of it. And within a couple of years, it was 70%. And this is really consistent. There's been a lot of studies done in Stockholm because there were a bunch of surveys done before and after by the city, but also by researchers as well. So this was one that was particularly well studied. But this is not unusual. This is a very, very normal thing to happen. And it happens, I mean, I don't even think congestion charging is the only place this happens.
Oh.
This happens with all kinds of urban
Everything. The smoking ban in New York City.
Yeah.
We were told it was going to destroy nightlife in the city, that bars were going to close, restaurants were going to go out of business. The exact opposite happened. And today, nobody can even remember. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when I would come home from bars and have to basically throw out most of my clothing.
That was so disgusting. I actually used to have clothes that I only wore to bars because they could never become clean again.
And now the idea that you would reintroduce smoking into bars would just be absurd. You saw this. We used to have cars in Central Park and Prospect Park. And there was a 20 or 30-year campaign to get those out. Finally, in 2018, cars were banned from both parks entirely. And again, the idea that you would reintroduce cars into the park, people would think you were nuts.
Yeah.
Obamacare here in the U.S., there was a massive freak out in the year or two before it was implemented, with everyone saying this was going to cost Democrats House seats. You had Congress people essentially running from their constituents as they were yelling at them. And then just a little while ago, during the first Trump administration, we had a massive demonstration because Republicans wanted to cut it, and everyone said, no fucking way.
Yeah.
You know, you just create a new political reality by creating a new political reality. That's the only way to do it. And Hochul, unfortunately, stuck us at that low moment of popularity where we are never going to see the benefits. Hopefully we will. We're going to keep fighting for that. But for now, we're just going to keep talking about how unpopular it was. And the narrative that is emerging now is that Democrats can't stick to their guns and can't see through stuff that they allegedly believe in,
Right.
they get scared of their own shadow and run away.
It's so frustrating. So I gave some of those approximate numbers, and the exact information is in the show notes to anybody interested. But what were the numbers of popularity leading up to this in New York City?
Well, I don't remember exactly what the polls were right before, but Siena College did a snap poll, I believe. Not a snap poll, but they did a pretty good poll right after Hochul announced her decision. And it showed that 45% of people agreed with her decision to suspend congestion pricing.
Right.
26% of people disagreed, and then the rest were either neutral or had basically no opinion. And if you really break down those numbers and look at that, so you say, okay, so it wasn't a majority of people who were against it, even after a couple of weeks of headlines saying Hochul cancels unpopular congestion pricing program.
Right.
That's actually better than Stockholm did right before implementation.
Yeah.
I think what I was sensing as congestion pricing was drawing nearer was, look, there were some lawsuits and there were angry stories in our tabloids about how terrible this was and all of the sad sack stories that they're good at exploiting. But you kind of got the sense that the fervor was dying down and it was just sort of like, let's go. Let's see what happens.
Right.
And then she pulls the plug, yanks the rug out, and set off this frenzy. And the funny thing is, I think, if she really did do this to quiet voters and gain a couple of votes here and there in some key House races, I think she's done the opposite. Because, as Stockholm shows, if you do it, the freak out ends really quickly. And it just becomes a part of the background, a part of nature, like a thing we've always had, like the smoking ban.
Right.
Instead, here we are a month later, we're still talking about it. The legislators are still getting phone calls about it. And it just won't go away. And it's not going to go away. And every subsequent subway delay, every traffic jam, every air quality alert day, now people are going to point to it and say,
we could have fixed this.
Yeah, congestion pricing might have done something about this.
We could have fixed this, but you canceled it, right?
Yeah.
So obviously you mentioned there was a lot of money put into the infrastructure, the cameras, all that kind of thing to make this function. There were also a bunch of transit projects that were depending on this money, right? Like that were in the planning.
Yeah. So congestion pricing was supposed to raise $1 billion a year. That was the revenue target. So right there, that's $1 billion a year that the MTA could have spent. And having a steady revenue source for the MTA meant that the MTA was on the verge of issuing all kinds of bonds. So there were $15 billion in capital improvements to the system itself that the MTA was going to basically start on. And this is actually an old capital plan. I think it's the 2020 to 2024 plan that they were going to sort of reverse pay for with these bonds. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those projects are things, like I said, signal upgrades. A lot of our signals are just very old mechanical stuff, parts that don't exist anymore because the system is just so old. So there was going to be an upgrade of just really unsexy things like signals and fan belts and water pumps and things like that. But there were also going to be things like accessibility upgrades. I think 18 stations were supposed to get elevators. The New York City subway system is pretty shameful in that a large number of our stations are not accessible by elevator. A total of 23 stations. If you broaden out a little more, we're going to get additional ADA upgrades. You had things like the electrification of our bus fleet. So there was going to be some upgrades to the bus depots to allow for electric buses, which is a key thing we need to do if we're going to fight climate change. Some of this stuff was going to improve stations out in Long Island at Metro North and Long Island Railroad stations, Westchester and Long Island, essentially. So you have a whole host of projects now that have been cut. And the MTA has basically said, look, all we can do now is keep the system running. Like, basic state of good repair is all we can do. Right. There were federal matching funds that congestion pricing was going to be a key component of. So we have the Second Avenue subway, which is a project that has been going on for decades. Recent phases of it opened under our last governor. That was going to be extended all the way up to Harlem. And that was dependent on us raising money through congestion pricing to then qualify for federal matching funds. We will not qualify for that money anymore. And those projects have been, there were literally trucks and equipment on the streets, ready to start digging when she pulled this plug.
Yeah.
So that stuff won't happen anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Like, she just stopped this. It sort of came out of nowhere. And it's like there were a lot of people that found out about it, a lot of people who were involved in projects, a lot of people who, like, their futures were dependent on this because there was this plan that had been put in place. That, like, this congestion charge isn't just something you turn on and off one day, right?
No, there's been reporting that she cost New York State in general 100,000 jobs, many of them high paying. I mean, you have companies like Alstom, which builds a lot of the subway cars and the train cars for the system. They were prepared to start building new train cars, and that now is in jeopardy. I think pretty much every county in New York State has some stake in the MTA, whether that's, like I said, the people who build the trains, accountants. There were literally going to be like a staff of a couple dozen people to manage the cameras and the tolling and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Those people, their jobs are gone. It's a disaster on every level.
Absolutely wild. It's absolutely wild to me that a governor can just come along and snap her fingers and, like, says all of this stuff you've been planning for years, all of these thousands of jobs, all of these people who are dependent on this, it's all gone now because I got vibes from a fucking diner.
And that's an important thing because, you know, she did literally just snap her fingers. I mean, literally, I'm saying she didn't just go, but she released this in a YouTube video. She didn't take questions from reporters. She's barely taken questions from reporters since, I think, only one press conference. And it is a question as to whether or not what she did was legal.
Right.
This is a 2019 law. The flaw in the law is that it doesn't state when congestion pricing has to start.
Right.
And so that is why she said indefinite pause and not I'm canceling it.
Right.
Because if she had said that, she would have been in direct violation of the law. There are lawsuits that are going to be filed. There's a coalition of advocacy organizations and other people who are filing a lawsuit to get this going. But lawsuits take months, if not years. And the delay could be the same whether there's a lawsuit or not. So here we are.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of when Rob Ford got elected as the mayor of Toronto. And he just went, as soon as he got elected, he just went to the people who were working on the LRT, this project called Transit City, which is a bunch of LRTs across the city. And he just canceled it. He just told the people, you're not doing this anymore. And everyone's like, we got a city council here that votes on things. But he just went up and said, no, it's done. And then he turned around for the cameras and said, the war on cars stops today. So there you go. There's your war on cars.
That's the inspiration for our title for our podcast.
Exactly, right? But this is the thing. It's like a lot of these laws, I find, and a lot of these structures that we have are dependent on politicians, like, following the rules and not being assholes. And so people can just come along and just be like, you know what? No, I'm just not going to do that. And there's kind of no structure in place to be like, you can't do that.
Yeah, I mean, if anything, we are living in an era, especially in the United States, but elsewhere, where the entire idea that there are laws is under threat.
Yes.
You know, we just granted our possible future president total immunity from all future crimes because what are laws? What is the Constitution?
That is freaking wild, by the way. I don't want to go down that rat hole.
That's a
but
separate
holy
podcast.
Shit,
Yeah.
when I saw that, I was like, why are people not screaming? Anyway, whatever. But yes, a lot of this stuff is really built on the fact that politicians and the people who run our governments are going to be like honest people that genuinely care about the system and the process, like as if we're all the founding fathers who genuinely care about the future of this country. Like, they can just come and say, just, no, I'm not going to do that. And there's no implications. There's no ramifications, no consequences.
No, and a lot of our understanding of the system, I think, is built on this idea that at least a fair number of our elected officials are rational people who kind of look at policy and data.
Yeah.
But as we're seeing with this congestion pricing debacle, that's just not the case. Like Hochul, as we said, just based this on vibes. And if anything, it's the silly advocates, the folks who are often dismissed as like the utopian idealists or the radicals or however you want to describe them, who are basically saying like, here's a list of the like 40 or 50 projects that are going to cost the MTA billions of dollars that they can no longer do. Do you have an answer for that?
Yeah.
And they don't. So one of the big things that has happened since she made this decision is that our state legislature has fielded more calls on congestion pricing, according to some officials, than on any single other issue. And that includes, I mean, we just came out of a bunch of tough years of COVID and masking and school shutdowns and all the rest.
Right.
They're getting more calls on this issue, even still, than anything else. So one of the things that she then proposed after she shut this down essentially was, well, you have to come up with a funding replacement for this $1 billion a year. And one of the things that she proposed was increasing the payroll tax on New Yorkers. Well, if her argument was that a $15 toll on a small number of drivers was going to be too hard on the little guy, on the working stiff who has to come into the city, why would raising taxes on every single worker in New York City be more fair than that?
It's absurd.
So she's really flailing and scrambling to come up with this and to cover for something that was just based on nothing, absolutely nothing. Because, as another writer said, the cars always win. And in this case, whatever car exhaust that she is inhaling directly into her lungs and then up into her brain, it just took over. And like I said, here we are. So look, all hope is not lost. There is a big advocacy campaign to get this going, to start it up. We've got lots of elected officials who have come out in favor of just flipping the switch, turning the cameras on, and getting it going. There's some discussion maybe about an off-ramp for Hochul where she figures out a way to do lower tolls that sort of soften the blow for drivers.
Right.
But that's a whole complicated mess that might mean redoing the law and starting a lengthy process. Like I said, it's a mess.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. Drivers always win in North America. Like, Jesus Christ, they really do. Like, it drives me nuts when people online are saying, like, oh, cyclists are so entitled. I'm like, you are out of your freaking mind. There is no one more entitled in this entire world than the suburban driver in North America.
And there is nobody more entitled than the suburban driver who enters Manhattan and thinks they should get to do that for free.
Manhattan, of all places. This is Manhattan. Like, yeah. I don't know if you're listening and you haven't been to Manhattan. I mean, everybody should know Manhattan from movies, right? But the reality of it is that this is a place where there are thousands of people on the sidewalk, like basically all the time. Like,
yeah,
wildly busy trains. And like, it's just, this is one of the most urban places on the earth.
Yeah, it's wild too, because the economic argument, I went into the city over the weekend with my wife and my son. So we spent $2.90 each to take the subway in one direction, and then $2.90 each to take the subway back home.
Right.
So my math is, we spent around $17 or $18 to go in and out of the city. A driver could have 4 people in their car, 3 or 4 people in their car, and still only pay $15 in one direction. To leave, it wouldn't cost them anything. And yes, there are tolls going to New Jersey and coming, depending on where you're going and all the rest. Right. But again, yeah, that entitlement of like, I get to bring this giant mobile living room and scour the streets of Manhattan for free parking. And that shouldn't cost me anything. But it will cost all of you in terms of pollution and traffic congestion and danger and noise. Yeah, sorry, the governor has the ear of those people and not me and my family.
Well, the other thing that annoys me so much about this is that whenever there is a discussion about anything getting more expensive for drivers, even gas prices or anything, there's always this, oh, what about these low income individuals who are really going to be hurt by this? But when transit fares go up, like when it becomes that almost $3 that you're paying now, there's hardly any of that. Those same people are just completely quiet about that. They're just like, well, transit fares go up, things get more expensive, what can we do?
I should add that congestion pricing had exemptions for low-income people living within the zone. So I think it was if you made $50,000 or $60,000 or less, you could claim your tolls as a tax credit and basically get a refund on all of that. Again, that was only for people who lived within the city.
Right.
But again, that's a very small number of people who are driving from, let's say, the East Village to a job outside of the city. But there were accommodations for those people because, look, every policy has winners and losers.
Yeah, that's inevitable.
And the best policies have a huge number of winners, a very small number of losers, and contain elements within the policy to mitigate the harms on those losers. Mm-hmm. And in this case, congestion pricing for whatever flaws people think it had a lot of those harm mitigation reduction strategies built into it. And still, it wasn't enough.
Yeah. And those improvements in transit would have been massive benefit to lots of people, but especially low-income people as well. It is absurd.
Yeah, I think a good thing to think about is that more people ride the New York City subway on the average weekday than fly domestically in the United States.
That's wild. That's absolutely wild.
And so when you talk about a policy that would have a massive number of winners, that's it right there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually funny. For my YouTube channel, I film a lot of my own content, but there's still a few things I grab here and there from stock photo sites. Sometimes just to mix it up in cities that I haven't been to film recently, or because, it's something generic like buses or something like that. And one of the things I often will search, say like Getty Images for, is public transit in the United States. Like, let's say I just talking about bus service and I need a bus. And I go on and I search for bus USA. And I always have to put minus NYC, because if I don't, the first 100 pages of results are going to be New York. And I'm like, no. I need anywhere else than New York City. That's where all the transit is.
Yeah. I think you're getting at something that we kind of talk about on the podcast, is that ultimately this congestion pricing fight is a fight between people who live in cities and people who don't live in cities.
Yeah.
And the people who don't live in cities, such as our governor, she's from upstate, she's from Buffalo, don't really have an understanding of how people who live in cities live. And New York is such an outlier in so many different ways, in that, look, there are cities in the US where the majority of transit riders are low income, but that's not the case here. Even though the majority of low income people take transit here, everybody takes transit. Everybody rides the bus. Everybody walks. Lots of people bike. And so you have this governor who she's not a whole lot different than my suburban relatives who don't understand how I get groceries.
Right.
I think she doesn't understand how we live. And so to her, like I said, the only person who really kind of exists in her head is the suburban driver.
Yeah.
And well, of course, they drive into the city, extract resources from it, and go home to their suburban house.
Yeah. And this is the windshield bias that I've talked about more times than I can count. We see exactly the same thing in Toronto, where there were a lot of things that were being done for road safety or widening sidewalks and things like that. And we're not even talking about bike lanes here. We're just talking about walking. And the statistics were that almost 50% of people who live and work in downtown Toronto walk to work, which is a huge number of people. But when you look at those statistics in Toronto, those modal share statistics that they call them, when you go out to the outer suburbs, which are still part of the city of Toronto since amalgamation in the 90s, it's 97% of people drive to work, 92%, 95%. And it's just a totally different world. And like you said, when we didn't own a car in Toronto and I would meet somebody at, a business event or something like that. I remember I went to an RBC bank to meet some customers and we were just talking and it came up that we didn't own a car. It is the number one question we'd be asked is, but how do you buy groceries? After living in Europe and London and all these other cities, I was just like, what an absurd freaking question. But that is always the number one question we get, because you're absolutely right. They just don't understand. They just fundamentally cannot think about that. And they don't go to the city. If I talk to somebody from the suburbs of Toronto who does go to Toronto for a show or something like that, they drive in. Now, they only come once every 2 months or 3 months or something like that. But when they come, they drive, they get frustrated. They talk about how expensive parking is. They say, I don't know how you guys live like this. They just don't understand.
Yeah, I think that also hits at something that I talk about a lot, which is not a revolutionary idea, but, people who stand to lose something are often much more vocal than people who don't know what they have to gain.
Yeah.
I often say, you can't organize the tenants of an affordable housing building that hasn't been constructed yet.
Yeah.
But it's really easy to get the single family homeowners who live next to the vacant lot and love their view and love the light and love the overgrown weeds next door to them to show up to the city council meeting or whatever it is to say, we don't want that 6-story building built next to us.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's happening with congestion pricing, is that, of course, Hochul was only ever going to hear from the folks who were saying, I can't afford $15, or I don't want to pay that, or I need to drive in because, I have to deliver a refrigerator to my old grandmother who has cancer and 7 dogs, and I can't take transit there. But the people who ride the bus, who don't have her ear, who don't maybe yet know that their commutes could be sped up by 10, 15 minutes, the people who are getting asthma from all the pollution, who would have less trouble breathing, the people who are not yet biking on streets that are clogged with cars but wouldn't be when there's a 15 to 20% reduction in automobile traffic in the city. Those people don't ever know that they have to show up too, because why would they?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I want to mention some stats from Stockholm again, because I know Stockholm is not New York City by any stretch of the imagination, but I think because it was so well studied, it's interesting to look at. So there was one study, again, I'll link it in the show notes if you're interested, about they went back and looked at it 5 years on, what the effects were, the acceptability and that kind of thing. And again, it was like 70% of people were in favor of it. When we say 70% in favor, it doesn't mean 30% are not in favor. There's undecided or not sure in there as well, right? So the vast majority of people are very much okay with this. People are not talking about removing this. That seems insane. But they found that high-income individuals were affected more than low-income individuals in Stockholm. The young and low-income individuals benefited from lower transit fares and improved transit. And the travel times in the city were shorter with a lower percentage by car. People really did switch from car to public transit. And again, it's just like what you're saying. When people see these benefits and when they're real, then they're going to be very vocal about somebody proposing to get rid of it after the fact. And I think your governor has really shot herself in the foot here, because I think she just totally missed the boat on this. She's totally blind to it, because I think what would have happened is that people would have been really, really upset. And then when it was there, it would have been like, wow, wait a second.
This would have been a non-issue by August. It would have been a non-issue.
But worse than that, I think it actually could have been a big benefit to say like, wow, look at what they've done here. I love it.
Yeah. Look, Democrats, if anything, right now in the United States need to be able to point to policies and say, look, every now and then we're going to do something that people are going to tell us isn't going to work and is unpopular. But we are the party of principles. We are the party of protecting the environment. We are the party of protecting low-income people. And we're going to stick to our guns and we're going to do it. And look what we just did in New York. We did the first in the nation congestion pricing charge. It worked. The city is better for it. The economy is better for it. And that's what you can get if you keep electing Democrats. That would be the message that I would have sent had I been in charge. But I'm not. So I just host a podcast.
Well, you clearly don't go to enough diners.
That's right. Not the right ones.
Not the right. You got to go to the ones right next to like the largest train station in the entire country that apparently people are driving into.
I would, but I can't find parking. Yeah.
I love the idea that you can't go to jail. And it reminds me, I remember this time in Toronto where because of this area that was designed just weird, they had to get rid of 3 parking spaces. And the one owner of a sandwich shop was losing his mind that if these 3 parking spaces were taken away, his shop would have to close. And as soon as you do like some basic napkin math, you're like, dude, if your sandwich shop is dependent on 3 parking spaces, like how many sandwiches are you selling those like 3 people that can park at any one time? Like it just doesn't work out. But this is not about logic. This is about vibes.
No, and the thing is, we went through this 14th Street in Manhattan during the de Blasio administration, our former mayor. They turned it into a busway, basically. And there was a New York Times article where they profiled a pizza shop owner, and he said that it was going to kill his business. And meanwhile, if you did a Google Street View of the pizza joint, the building where the business itself was barely wider than 1 parking spot.
Right.
So you're like, if your entire business in the heart of Manhattan depends on a single parking spot or 3 parking spots, you are in the wrong location. Like you are not good at business and you should move or rethink your business plan. And sure enough, it went in and all the screaming about 14th Street died down. And it's just like, rinse, lather, repeat. We just go through the same thing over and over again.
It is kind of frustrating. This is one of those things that really annoys me about being involved in any of this urban planning sphere, is that it's the same shit all the time, every single time.
It's happens. Memento, basically. And they don't really even tattoo themselves with the lessons from last
I know,
time.
right?
Yeah.
Can somebody please look at every other city that's done this? And literally the same thing happens. But speaking about the pizza parlor owner, if anybody's interested, you can go and listen to my recent podcast with Bike Curious about how some business owners really hate bike lanes. Because one of the things that has been found in some of those cases, I'm not saying this particular pizza owner, but it has been shown in several instances that when these business owners are complaining about removing these parking spaces, the reason they're doing that is because they park there. Like that's their
Yes.
parking space.
Yeah.
That's the place they park and then go in and work. So they're not even being used by their customers because it's taken by them.
Look, and even if they themselves are taking transit or are not that worried about parking, like when is the last time if you took transit, walked, or biked to a restaurant that you walked in and said to the host or the manager when they said, "Oh, how are you?" You said, "Oh, I'm great. I want to tell you the bus was on time. I found a bike parking spot right out front, or my walk was so pleasant." Never. You never say that.
Never do
But if you drive and they say, "How are you?" the first thing out of your mouth is, "Oh, parking sucks around here."
Yeah.
And
No,
so
it's true.
the business owners hear that and they think 1,000% of their customers drive, and they don't notice the ones who just show up, eat, pay the bill, smile, and then get on a bus and go home. Look, I do think, to add a note of optimism here.
Yeah, why don't we talk a little bit about, like, look, we've talked about this. I
Yeah.
think we could go back and forth about this forever. I know you and I could because we've met for beers several times before. But let's talk about, like, okay, what's the future here? What's
Okay.
the likely outcome and what can anybody do about this?
So I think the positive thing here that will lead to sort of what you can do is that, just like we were saying, that people who don't know what they have yet to lose typically don't call or act or complain. We were so close to getting the first in the nation congestion pricing program after literally decades of activism that when Hochul did what she did, she actually activated those people who feel that they have something to lose. So we had 800 people marching in the street like a week later. We had multiple rallies where tons and tons of people showed up. Like I said, elected officials have received more calls on this issue than any other single issue. So look, if you live in the New York region, and that includes New Jersey, Connecticut, any place that is connected to the city by transit, call your elected officials. That includes your officials in Washington, your representatives in Congress, and ask them to take a position on this because there is federal funding involved here. There's a federal process that was involved here. Ask them to take a position and use their power, like we have been contacting Senator Chuck Schumer or our local congresspeople, to get them to make statements and pressure the governor to get this started as soon as possible. If you don't live in New York, look, there's a fear that other U.S. cities are going to say, "Oh, look at New York, what a mess." Like, so Chicago, we're not going to do congestion pricing. San Francisco, Boston, all these places that would be natural next cities for congestion pricing.
Oh, San Francisco would be for sure. I live there.
Absolutely. Any place with a sort of small geographic footprint and natural, quote unquote, natural entries and exits for cars would be great. I think the optimistic take here is that there is an opportunity for the right elected officials in those cities to say, look, New York didn't do congestion pricing and then it failed. They didn't do congestion pricing and then it didn't lower traffic and didn't raise the revenue. They did it because their governor got cold feet because she chickened out and she sucks. And look at all the people who are ready to fight for it. We here in Chicago, San Francisco, Boston, maybe our politics are better right now and we can get it going. So I don't think this is the end for congestion pricing nationally. I don't think it's the end for congestion pricing here in New York, because so far nobody has said, "Oh, yeah, that's fine. Okay, we'll try again in 30 years.
Right.
Something's different this time."
Right. Well, hopefully this is just a blip and it'll be a footnote in congestion charging history. You've got everything ready. It could be flipped on tomorrow.
Pretty much.
So there is still some hope here. So anyway, yes, if you do live in or around the New York area, please do contact your local representatives. People are often so negative about, saying like, contact your political representatives, you got to vote. I know people are always so negative about this, but certainly when it comes to municipal politics, it really is this squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like, these people really do respond to this. They don't like getting a bunch of angry calls from people. And again, 3% of drivers managed to get this thing flipped. 3% of angry urbanists could get it flipped back, right? Like,
yeah, look, I had an elected official tell me, why do they respond so much to lost parking spaces? When people call their office, why do they jump? It's because it's a thing they can do. They can restore the lost parking spaces.
Right.
Whereas if anybody called and say, "Hey, just want to let you know my trash was picked up yesterday and my street was cleaned and the potholes got fixed," they just say, like, "Thank you." There's no action item that they can do. Well, here with congestion pricing, if you call your elected official, there's something they can do. They can make a public statement. They can talk to the governor. and they can hopefully get it turned on. So I think we, on the urbanist nerd side of things, we're a much larger constituency than we used to be.
Especially in New York.
Especially now in New York. And we have a lot more power than we used to have. And people are listening to us, and we are a force to be reckoned with, and we ought to use that power seriously.
Yeah. And really, it does make a difference to annoy public officials. They don't like being annoyed, and you're right. They do love when they get annoyed being able to point to it and say, oh, look, I did that. Vote for me next time. It really does work that way.
Be annoying is the lesson. Absolutely.
Be annoying. Okay, well, that's a good point to end on. Urbanists, be annoying. Not to YouTubers on Twitter.
Some people would say we're on top of that already. Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Thanks so much for coming on, Doug. If you're not familiar with it, Doug runs a podcast, fantastic podcast, a podcast that releases a lot more often than this one, called The War on Cars. And it's well worth listening to.
Thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good to have you on anytime. Cheers. Good luck in New York City.
Thanks.
That's all we have today for the Urbanist Agenda, but if you just can't wait to hear the next episode, I recommend you sign up to Nebula because every episode is uploaded there first. You can sign up at nebula.tv/agenda, and doing so also supports this podcast. Nebula also gives you access to all of the other creators who are on there, which is now over 150 at this point. You'll find videos and podcasts and classes, but there are also Nebula Originals, which are high-budget productions by content creators you may already know on a whole wide range of educational subjects. If you sign up with our link, that's nebula.tv/agenda, then you'll get a discount off a yearly membership. That's $20 off, bringing it down to $30 per year, which is honestly a hell of a deal for what you're getting. Thanks again for listening to the Urbanist Agenda, and maybe next time you'll be listening on Nebula, and then you won't even hear this part.